Welcome everybody. My name is Untitled. I'm a partner with NGP Capital and lead our enterprise software investments globally. For those of you who may not be familiar, NGP Capital is a global growth stage venture fund investing in data-driven technology startups trying to create the connected world. We are a thesis-driven investor, and our focus is on really the digital transformation of enterprise through software. And cybersecurity is a critical part of that transformation journey. I want to thank you all for attending our CxO event, the last CxO event of this year. And we've kept the best for last with a really distinguished two speakers we have today. In audience today, we have really a great mix of entrepreneurs, industry professionals, investors, and security experts. And many of them are dialing from around the world. So without further ado, I just wanted to introduce the two security leaders in our call. Sorry, I went on mute there, guys. I don't know if you missed you there. I just want to say I will not probably do justice to either of you, but I just still will try to make a short attempt to introduce both of you. So interestingly, both of you are security experts and PhDs and doctorates, which shows the caliber of your understanding of the space, both from a research and theory perspective, as well as practitioners, which will really give us a great perspective. So first, Dr. Ed Amaroso. Ed is the CEO of Tag Cyber, one of the world's leading research and advisory firms, helping large enterprises understand how to mitigate and control their cybersecurity risks. Ed has been at the forefront of security for most of his career, all of his career. He was a critical part of Bell Labs and AT&T for over 30 years, and left as the senior VP and its chief security officer, which a position he held for nearly 2 decades. Ed is currently a research professor at NYU School of Engineering. He's also been an adjunct professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology for over 30 years, and thousands of students have benefited from his insights and have become professionals protecting our environments around the world. He's authored over 6 books, and he's also advised a number of presidential administrations in the USA over the last few decades. Next, we have Dr. Alex Yampolksiy, the co-founder and CEO of SecurityScorecard. Full disclosure, I'm honored to be on the board of SecurityScorecard for over 4 years, and it's been a great journey for me to be a friend of Alex. Alex has led this company pretty much from 2013 to become the world's largest and the most trusted security ratings company in the world. His vision is much bigger than ratings. His vision is really to create a new language for cybersecurity so that he can enable people to work collaboratively across enterprise with their partners in a way where communication, collaboration, and productivity can be accomplished in a very secure ecosystem and environment. So welcome both of you, Alex and Ed. It's a true honor to have you.
Thank you, Paul. And Ed, it's great to see you.
I see. You know, now I'm going to make believe I'm a professor here because I do this so much during the week. Britta or one of the folks, I think if you hit the unmute or the mute all button, and then I'll unmute myself, but it sounds like there's some background here. Normally, I would make There we go. Now I'm unmuted. Normally, that's like I drop everybody's grade when they're making noise, but we're not giving anybody grades here. So I guess we can't do that. But thanks. That sounds better. And if people want to come off mute, they can. Alex, how are you doing? Nice to see you.
I'm great. It's great to be here, and doing a panel with you is always fun. We get to talk about a lot of fun stuff and learn from each other. So it's always a pleasure to be speaking to top leaders like Ed.
You know, Alex, there's a couple of themes that I see every day in the work that we do with clients. I'm an analyst, Tag Cyber's an analyst firm, so we're dealing with customers having problems all day long. And both of them live in your backyard. You know, they're things that your team focuses on. One is metrics and the other is third party risk. And I just want to pose a couple things here to see what you think, because I consider you an expert in both of those areas. But the first around metrics, I think just about everybody comes to us and says, how do we measure whether things are okay? Whether it's a board member saying, how do we compare? Is there some way of doing it? Or a practitioner saying they don't know whether their controls are working. So that's sort of the first dimension. And then the second is doing that for your third parties. For a lot of companies almost makes their head explode. They can barely do it for themselves, much less for companies that are removed from their day-to-day sort of operation. I see both of those two things every day, and I think that they are part of the root cause for why there's so much trouble right now. Like every day, week, it seems like we don't even get surprised when we see that somebody's been massively hacked. But I'm curious, because again, I consider you one of my expert friends in both of those areas. You guys hear that too? Is it like that metrics and the third party, that cross product? Just whenever I hear it, I cringe because I see so many companies really struggling there. What's been your experience there?
Well, if you look at what has been happening just in IT space over the past 10 years, the attack surface became exponentially more complex, right? Like 10, 12 years ago, most of the data was stored within your data center. Then people started traveling, logging into work from homes, from hotel rooms. Then with the advent of the cloud, more and more information started shifting to different type of service providers. With the advent of edge computing, with the proliferation of IoT and OT devices, now a lot of the devices that were simple before, now they do sophisticated AI, video streaming, data processing, and they also are an avenue for attack. So the amount of entry points for attackers really exponentially increased. And most chief security officers and CIOs are struggling because they could do a fantastic job protecting themselves. But then if one of their third-party suppliers, if one of the services that they use in the cloud gets compromised, then their sensitive information can get stolen, right? Like, and most people don't know how to deal with this complexity because it's exponentially increasing. But as humans, we cannot make exponential progress, right? Like we're only increasing cybersecurity defenses linearly. And so the answer to dealing with complexity is always metrics, right? Like it's always information, because you need to know where to prioritize and to pay your attention. You're not going to be able to catch every little thing because it's coming all at you very fast and all at once. So we've seen increasing rise in KPIs and metrics, and that was a space that we pioneered at SecurityScorecard, because when I was a chief security officer at an e-commerce company years ago, I had a lot of different solutions, but I had no idea how I'm doing. I had no idea how my suppliers were doing. I had no idea how to report to my board of directors to convince them that I need more investment. And it felt very strange to me that you could drive a car and you see a speed dial, like a speedometer showing to you the speed you're going. You go to a doctor, they're going to measure your blood pressure. They're going to ask you to step on a scale. You buy Eaton Vance municipal bonds, you're going to look at Fitch ratings or S&P ratings. But in cybersecurity, something like that has not existed, right? Like it's just not existed. And so we've been building all the solutions while flying in the dark and not using KPIs. And I think the acceleration of a shift to the cloud, the interconnectedness with your suppliers, with your software as a services, only exacerbated and increased the problem.
You know, yesterday I was eating my lunch and I get a call from one of our customers, a chief information security officer for a pretty decent sized company. And he says, we were talking about something. He said that they'd had an incident this past week, maybe not big enough that it hits Krebs, but enough that it was something they had to notify customers. And you'll recognize this. It was a third party that somebody had engaged with in the company, but hadn't gone through normal channels. And then that third party had been given some data. They were doing a marketing thing, you know, where you did like a lot of companies will engage with a third party creative group to market some event or whatever. And then they gave them some customer data to promote the event. And the data had been fumbled, and you know that story. So he came and said, what are we doing? It's, you know, that's partly just bad supply chain management or something, you know, that like, I agree with you on attack surface. I think that's a massive issue, like figuring that out. But maybe even a step before the attack surface is just a lot of companies have very broken processes for how they do contracts, how they engage with companies. You guys see that? Because I know you guys spend a lot of time helping companies rate and score and come up with risk assessments of their third parties. But what do you tell companies when they maybe don't even know who their third parties are, which is what happened here? You know, the guy didn't even know who they were.
Well, I think the one thing you mentioned, which was quite astute. I mean, you really need to think about developing capabilities. It's not about solving a tactical problem, but it's how do you build a repeatable capability to do something over and over again. So for example, I get calls all the time from people who are owners of businesses, and they panic and they don't know what to do because they got hit with ransomware or somebody launched a denial of service attack after their business, and they scramble. They don't know what to do. They have no idea how to react. And usually it's too late, right? Like when the fire broke out and you've not had a playbook for how to deal with it, it's too late. So I think that businesses, really big and small, should focus on developing the repeatable capabilities for how to mitigate the risk. For example, who are you going to call if you get hit by ransomware? Did you back up your sensitive data? Do you even know where your sensitive data resides? A lot of companies do not take the time to really be explicit instead of implicit about how those things work. And by documenting those things, by being explicit about the defenses and about the controls, you already move the needle in the right direction. And so the three areas that are really making things worse. So one, which we mentioned, the attack surface is becoming more complicated. The world is more complex. You have digitization of information, proliferation of IoT devices, 5G is coming, so more small devices are connected to each other. We cannot control the fact that the world is becoming more complicated. Secondly, we cannot control the fact that attackers now have access to more sophisticated cyber weaponry. Things became a marketplace. You can hire people to write a zero-day exploit for you. You can hire ransomware as a service for somebody to go infect a target with a ransomware. You don't need to know how to do all those things. It became a marketplace where you can pay $40 a day and launch a denial of service attack to take out the website of your competitor. So again, we cannot control it. We cannot control the fact that the world is more complex. We cannot control the fact that there's a proliferation of cyber weapons. But what we can control, and that's what most companies do not pay attention to, is how do you become more resilient? How do you build the right playbooks, the right capabilities? How do you put the right KPIs and measurements in place? How do you start focusing on being resilient instead of robustness? How do you assume that you're going to be compromised sooner or later, and then you make your systems as difficult to exfiltrate information as possible? That's the resilience mindset, instead of trying to prevent the inevitable, trying to prevent an attacker from getting in, right? Like, so we can control what we focus on, we can control the basics, we can control the accountability piece, and that's the piece where a lot of companies fail on doing the basics.
You know, let's stay on that resilience point. I'd like to share a couple of stories with the folks here that I think carry a message, maybe from a different era, but one that I think we've lost. It was back in the old Bell Labs, AT&T days, kind of during the heyday of the company, when networks were operated with the presumption that you had 5 nines reliability and resilience against cyber attacks and other things. That's what I spent my life doing. You know, we used to do, and it sounds, when I tell people we did this, it sounds almost like it's from another world or another galaxy that anyone would do this. But we would take the network, and 4 times a year, some of you may remember this, we'd schedule these events in big football stadiums where big customers would come, be thousands of people there. And we'd very ceremoniously break the network and then demonstrate the resilience in real time that was practiced on a monthly basis and displayed for customers 4 times a year. When I even describe that now, people say, oh my God, that must have cost a fortune. And the answer was yes. And they said, how, you know, how did it always work? And the answer was yes, it always worked. And then when there was a real catastrophe, it was almost like day-to-day muscle memory to fix it. And I would say for all of you listening, I know there's a lot of people who run IT and run infrastructure, there's CTOs, CIOs, and CISOs here. I know you're not going to go to that level of planning, but I'm pretty sure you don't do enough. Alex, I did a tabletop with the CEO and CEO's direct reports for a very large tech company. One you all know, you say their name all the time. They did not have a ransomware plan. They hadn't thought it through. And the idea that they would even test something like that kind of blew their mind. We even had the CFO saying, well, we're going to release ransomware. Isn't that like getting attacked? And you almost want to roll your eyes and say, no, that's not how a test would work. But nevertheless, you know, there would need to be a little bit of learning there. I'm amazed at how, like you mentioned, cyber resilience, how the bar has become so much lower. We used to have a high bar on that sort of thing where you want to talk to me about resilience. Show me how you're testing. Show me your plan. Show me you're exercising it. Now, it's almost as if you did something like that, you'd be accused of running up the operating cost and driving down margins, you know, by doing something that nobody would assume. So I don't know what you think about that. For me, I lament that we've allowed the definition of what it means to be resilient to drop to something that I believe is nowhere near high enough. I don't know how you feel about that.
What do you think caused it? Like, what do you think caused this deterioration?
Yeah, I think like an analogy is DevOps, right? I come from a world where I think the way God intended software to be built was with the old waterfall model. You take your time, you plan it, just like you do anything else in life. And we've become so jittery and so demanding of change, the world, that for all of us who build technology, we can't even take the time to plan something properly. That's the essence of DevOps. Look, I'm for doing things quickly and I'm for innovation, I'm for change. But I think the world has just sped up. Everything is sped up. When we built the first 4ESS software in the 70s, you know what the design goal was? One failure every 40 years. That's what it was. And there was one. January 15th, 1990, Martin Luther King Day. We all remember it. Anybody who grew up in the Bell system remembers that there was a failure that day. And guess what? From 1970 to about 2010, that was the only failure. It's one. And you know how you do that? You do it by building Unix systems where you tear all the features out. You make it so teeny and small and minuscule that there's not going to have problems because ones and zeros don't wear out. There's no such thing as software maintenance. Software doesn't need to be maintained. It's when you make changes that you introduce problems. So look, I'm not arguing we shouldn't innovate. We all make a living off of that, and it's exciting. But the exhaust that comes from all that innovation are security problems. Alex, I think that's why your team is so busy. Things are happening so quickly that it creates these security vulnerabilities. And anybody on this call who really right now is maybe not investing enough in security, remember that if you want to go quickly, you need seatbelts, you need helmets, and there's way too many businesses that are whizzing along at 150 miles an hour wearing the same safety equipment that they were when they were going 20 miles an hour. It's very big
No,
difference.
I'll disagree with you for sake of making a conversation interesting. So I'll give an analogy, a real life analogy. So we moved to Connecticut about a year ago. So in order to get to our office in New York City, when I drive, I have to take I-95, from Connecticut into New York City.
Right.
I'm not gonna lie, it's a terrible commute.
It's a
There are
terrible.
a lot of
I know that.
I-95 is always congested. There are a lot of crazy drivers.
Right.
By the way, there's rules and regulations, there's signs around I-95 and police everywhere. Nonetheless, I looked up a statistic just out of curiosity, and it's the second worst highway in the United States. So if you look at a number of crashes per mile, the number of crashes is ridiculous, despite all the police, despite all the signs, despite all the stuff. You compare it with a German Autobahn, where people can drive at an almost unlimited speed, and it's one of the safest places.
Right.
And so why is it, right? So it's an interesting question to ask. Why is in German Autobahn, people drive so quickly, there's not as much, police, but one of the safest, and an I-95, terrible experience. And so I believe a lot of it actually has to do with what does it take to really drive on an Autobahn? There's a social system, right? Just a social habit system where if somebody is behind you, you yield, right? You yield automatically to the right. In order to drive there, you have to go through rigorous safety training before you go on the road, right? There's also a culture. There's a little bit different culture. In the US, you don't take as much training. You don't have this kind of social culture type of conduct, right? And so as a result, even though people put a lot of safety precautions, it's still a terrible experience and it's not safe. And so I think if you drive the analogy to cybersecurity, I do believe that actually you can move very, very quickly. The business is not slowing down. The global business is only accelerating. And so it's not surprising that people want to do things faster without concern for cybersecurity. But I think that we just need to start doing it smarter, where, for example, nobody's talking about what's a minimal viable security, right? How do we set a minimal viable standard for cybersecurity when you build software? Instead of building software and then scratching ahead and saying, oh crap, right? Everything I built was insecure. So I think we just need to change our mindset of how we approach things.
Yeah, it's funny, just extending the analogy, I would say in both cases, the Autobahn and in I-95, automation and autonomy are likely to be parts of a solution moving forward, meaning if we get to the point where we learn to use automation properly, we're getting there with some things. I suspect that things are going to get better. And I think regardless of how quickly you go, and when I say quick, obviously the movement is a metaphor. I'm talking more about this barrage of features that gets pushed onto software developers and at such a rate and such a pace that it's very difficult for them to think them through. But I think with automated tools, and I think with the advent of the way we build applications now, which is mostly automated, I think things can get better. You as bullish as I am that automation is part of the solution moving forward?
I'm pretty bullish there. So we're in a point where you have a lot of tools, a lot of startups, a lot of solutions.
Yeah.
Most chief security officers you speak to, they're overwhelmed and they're inundated because they get calls, they get emails every single day. They want those systems to work better together. The systems need to be integrated better together. You need to have automation, integration, so that you can have all the systems share information with each other and deduce the insights out of it. So overall, I'm bullish. I do see more organizations becoming proactive instead of reactive. I see more conversations about integration happening. I see more boardrooms speaking about cybersecurity risk and really raising a dialogue. And I mean, I know you advise a lot of boards and you've been on a board of a number of banks yourself. What is the type of dialogue, what is the type of conversation you're hearing at the board level of cybersecurity?
Wow, don't get me started on that. No, I have a very strong set of opinions on that. So first, let's start with things that I like. I like the idea that the conversation has found its way into the boardroom, to your point. I think that that's a healthy thing. I think boards should be aware that cybersecurity has become a material issue. Alex, you and I would say one of the very top ones. I mean, this is what we do for a living. This is our life. But if you balance it against the other risks in the company, I think any observer, even one that knows very little about cybersecurity, would have to conclude that what we all do has become a material issue for boards. They need to be aware of it. So I'm very happy with that. I also like the idea that we're starting to see some people with a little bit more technical background finding their way onto boards. I think that's good. It may just be that the actuarial tables are in our favor. As board members just get too old and leave, they generally are replaced with people who actually know how to turn on a PC. You're be amazed at the Luddite quality of many board meetings. That's quite a problem. But so that's a good thing. And I think a third good thing is that usually cybersecurity has become at least an agenda item at most meetings. So those are three good things. Let me tell you some things that I think are not so good. So the first thing is that we've all been taught, we CISOs and a lot of the people on this call, I'll bet you a good percentage of the people on this call have some responsibility to brief their board at one point or another. Here's what you are told to do when you go and see a board, and I think it's evil. It's put the cybersecurity concepts in business terms, make it understandable for board members, make it so that they can follow, that they can put it in simple terms so that they can absorb what you're talking about. I think that's a terrible thing to do. I think what happens is you trick them into thinking that what we do is oh so utterly trivial. Oh my gosh, it's just a people problem. Just pick better passwords, we'll be fine. Oh my gosh, it's so simple. 99% of the problems that happen, we've seen before. It's just a matter of doing these 3 or 4 basics. And they come away thinking that it's just all of us through lazy negligence, that we have these cybersecurity problems. I think it's a terrible thing. What I prefer to do, and what I've adopted as my new absolute requirement when I'm asked to speak with boards, here's the requirement. Number 1, I will not dumb down the discussion. I will brief you as a peer. Number 2, the concepts I'm going to refer to, I will refer to in the discourse that we use in cybersecurity, because I'll tell you what, when I join boards, they don't dumb down the financial discussions for me. They don't. If I don't know what EBITDA means, well, that's my problem. And you know something, if at lunchtime during a break, I take somebody aside and I say, what is this? What is meant by payback periods on an investment? There would be social consequences to that ignorance. I guarantee you. It may not be you get kicked off the board, but there'd be some whispering going on. The social consequences would be significant. And yet it's not a big deal before a board meeting for everybody to go, oh my gosh, I can barely turn on this iPad. Oh, can somebody help me here? And then a bunch of interns descend on the board meeting to help all the Luddites turn on their iPads. And then they're going to provide judgment on cybersecurity. So I believe that there should be a self-selection process where when you get in there with the board, I think you let them have it. And if they don't understand something, then you know something, that's their problem. And they should recognize that what we do is not trivial. And when you're dealing with an adversary that's a nation state, well, yeah, maybe they'll try the easy stuff, but if the easy stuff doesn't work like a fish, no problem. They can do something way more advanced. It's just they'll start with easy stuff. So this idea, fix easy stuff, the problem goes away, is a gigantic misconception. So Alex, I know your team in particular comes up all the time in the context of board meetings. I think that what you guys do is a good abstraction of some solid cybersecurity work that maybe they can sort of understand because there's a quantitative component to it. But I would encourage you and your team that when you're explaining these things to boards, to make sure that they know that there's a lot behind the scenes. I've had you come speak with my NYU students about your algorithms. There's a lot behind that curtain. And that would be something I would say that as you integrate or interact with boards, once in a while, open that curtain and let them know that this is not some trivial thing that we do. This is extremely difficult. And that when you guys are rendering judgment on someone, it's not some surface thing. I've looked, I see what you guys do. There's a lot of computer science and a lot
Tricky,
of
right? Like, and I think you
lot
hit
there.
I think you hit on a nail in the head in a couple of things, right? Because kind of the challenge always is when you use KPIs, just in general, right? Whether it's our KPIs or any other KPIs. KPIs are always very useful, right? Like they're actionable, you can act on them, but at the same time, whenever you start focusing on one KPI, it's like a rubber band, right? Like you pull on it and you ignore all the other things. If you're looking only at the speedometer of a car, you might be ignoring how much gas you have in a tank, right? Like if you're only looking at gas in the tank, you might ignore other stuff. And the same, I think, for measuring and quantifying cybersecurity, we always tell to people that the grades and the scores that we provide and the analytics behind it are never going to substitute human judgment, right? Like we can tell you who is safer, who is less safe. We can tell you all the data and the insights behind it. But at the end of the day, I believe any cybersecurity product, it's not even about the cybersecurity product, but it's about a efficiency product. How do you help people make smarter, faster, better decisions? But I remember, Ed, actually analogy you gave a couple of years ago. It may have been like as long as 4 or 5 years ago at a conference where we also both presented. And I remember you did this analysis where you looked at leadership pages of companies and you looked at the titles. And you looked at the titles, and I remember you were speaking about it. You look at a leadership page, you see CEO, CRO, CFO, General Manager of Latin America. But very rarely when we look at leadership pages of companies, we're going to see a Chief Security Officer. Very rarely you're going to hear, oh, a CISO just got promoted to Chief Financial Officer, or a CISO just adopted new responsibility to help grow the Latin American revenue. It's still not happening. I don't think that in the past 5 years, the situation has changed that much. But I don't know, what has your experience been?
Well, the analogy that I always draw is to personnel departments. Because if you go back into the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 100 years ago, there were not really personnel departments, but there might have been a couple of people typing up badges somewhere, just creating some very basic things for employees. And then once World War II hit, what happened was we all realized how important it was to put people in the right roles. So right after World War II, just about every large company created something called a personnel department with a personnel manager who would be working with managers to make sure people in the right roles. And that gradually bubbled up to human resources, to VP of human resources. And now today, every CEO in the Fortune 1000 would have a human resources lead reporting directly to the CEO. And that human resources lead would typically have a collage of background experiences the way most executives do. I think that security over the next 20, 30 years will travel in the same direction, because it used to be had 2 people doing the firewall, and then it came an IT security group, and then became a VP of security, then a chief information security officer. And then in some cases that might have some seniority. I was an officer at AT&T, so I had a great deal of seniority there and could operate with peers who are running the business units. That was my case. There's a couple others. Craig Froelich at Bank of America has a sizable job. Phil Venables at Google, sizable. There's some people who've managed to get to a very sizable kind of coverage. But I think it's bubbling up. And my prediction has been that at some point, 10, 15 years from now, every CEO will have an information or risk executive. And to your point, it'd be nice if they had a collage of skills, some finance, some line operations, marketing, IT, and yes, security, instead of a bunch of gearheads like us, kind of working your way up, through a very siloed career path to become the CISO, and then become sort of a capped dead end, where once you're the CISO, There's no other place. That's why so many of them get fired and moved around. Once they get to that top job, they rarely get moved around. They get kicked out. So that's not good. That's not the way to run a railroad. And I think that will change, but I don't think it's changed yet. You're right. The last few years, I haven't seen it shift too much, but eventually it will. Eventually it will.
So, we hear about ransomware all the time, right? Like ransomware is a plague for so many organizations. What is your advice of what you think organizations should do to prepare to mitigate ransomware attacks? Do you think it's gonna continue? Any words of wisdom?
What I've seen, Alex, I'm curious what you think, is that ransomware is not this event that occurs as a boom, ransomware hits you the way an arrow would slam into a target. It's the result of an operational campaign. Ransomware usually is associated with ransomware ops, where a lot of the same kinds of things that you see with APTs and other kinds of cyber attacks occur. So my feeling is that rather than try to stop that one disease, like you wouldn't live your life saying, oh my gosh, I'm just going to make sure I don't get malaria, whatever I do. You wouldn't do it that way. You'd think healthy, and you try to do things that are going to make you a more resilient, a more healthy individual. I think businesses should do the same thing. Like rather than kind of sit and stew on the attack that we worry about today, which happens to be ransomware. Well, what would have been the case in the 90s? You were worried about network security. And then in the 2000s, we were worried about worms hitting. And then in the latter part of the 2000s, it was DDoS attacks. And then after that, it was all the credential problems like Target and so on. And now it's ransomware and phishing. What's the next going to be? I believe scary industrial control attacks are going to come. I think manipulation of artificial intelligence will come. And I think we're headed to a global cyber war at some point. I think that's going to be a much more scary predicament when a country can flip the lights on and off in certain countries. What if some country could do that to the US? They could call up, the Biden folks and say, hey, watch this. And they flip the lights on and off in Portland. They go, what'd you think of that? They go, hey, watch this. And they turn the water off in Chicago. They go, what do you think of that? And they keep doing it until we wave the white flag. That's called a cyber war. And nobody on this call should view that as science fiction. What I've just described is not only feasible, but I feel like we are barreling to that type of scenario. So that's why when people ask about ransomware, I say, well, expand your focus, protect your company, make it more resilient, make it simpler, make sure you have good metrics, make sure you have the right people, get rid of things you don't need. These are all the kinds of things that we do that will get you better. When I'm dealing with SecurityScorecard, I'm going to that'll be reflected in the way you guys would be, viewing our attack surface. So all those things are going to get you better rating. But that would be my answer, Alex. I'd say worry less about the specific problem du jour and focus more on becoming a better, more resilient company, because I think there's scarier things coming. I don't mean to ruin anybody's lunch here, but I do think that we are barreling towards some very frightening scenarios.
And I know that, so Ed and I collaborated on a book, The Perfect Scorecard, where we interviewed a lot of CISOs, board members. And I remember one of the good conversations that I had was with, which is a chapter in a book, but we talked with Secretary Ray Mabus, who was a Secretary of Navy under Obama administration. And he talked a lot about the wartime mentality and how does a wartime mentality apply to CISOs. And so in a wartime mentality, you can never have downtime. You can never relax. You can never rest on your laurels. CISOs cannot be just goalies keeping people out. They also must be attackers who use new tools, new strategies to get ahead of attackers and proactively block attacks before they happen. And I remember the one tip that Secretary Mabus gave is that adaptability is a critical part of a wartime mentality. And when he was a Secretary of the Navy, he used to sit on deployments and debriefings of carrier teams, right? Like carrier strike teams who've been on 8 and 9 month deployments in the sea. And there was only one constant in every debriefing. The group always faced an obstacle that they had not expected or trained for, no matter how much they prepared for, no matter how much they trained, no matter how much money they spent. Every carrier strike team always faced an obstacle that they had not expected or trained for, and they just had to figure it out while the incident was happening. And so the same analogy applies to CISOs. It's not about also how good you are, how smart you are, but it's about adaptability. And the same applies for organizations to survive and thrive in today's environment. It's all about adaptability and being able to roll with the punches when adverse circumstances occur and take place.
Well, I remember that piece in that interview. Very, very good analogy. And I agree that adaptability is a big issue. It's one of the reasons why I think in our community, we've developed, I personally think, a more balanced view of things like compliance. Is when compliance is done right, it's done continuously, it's done through embedded data collection, and it doesn't require these point in time assessments where somebody comes in with a clipboard, you know, the usual kind of nonsense with that. But unfortunately, there's still too much point in time clipboard work, you know, somebody with a checklist and you prove that you did all these things and then you hang something on the wall. What happens when you do that is you don't want to adapt or change because you could invalidate your compliance. Let's say you're working, you know, you got a whole tool infrastructure. Let's say you're using, I don't know, Prisma for something, and you got it all tangled through your infrastructure. And then for whatever reason, after you've done all your compliance work and the audit and everything's done, you decide you want to move like to Fortinet. I'm just making this up. You certainly realize, or at least one of the factors is, wow, I've got to go back and redo all of that, you know, and it can make you less kind of willing to make changes. So I always, in the compliance community, I always look for that adaptability, because in a wartime setting, like going back to sort of the conventional war, you know how the great war fighters, and even like in movies and something, General Patton and so on, they usually kick all the compliance and rules out the window. And they say, don't talk to me about a bunch of rules. I'm going to adapt and fight and win. Those are the words that they would use. It doesn't always apply in cybersecurity, but a little bit of that does. This, what you're saying, the ability to be able to change and adapt and modify, I love that. And I think that's the way you play defense. But the compliance community has to start getting more comfortable with that and maybe change the way assessments are done, make them more about posture and about situational awareness than about like a report where you get a compliance that you hang on the wall. You know, hey, we are such and such certified. We've all seen that. I think that word, the Brits have it right. Certified means crazy. And I'm not a big fan of certification in that sense. I like better posture assessments that give me a dashboard and tell me where I am. I love that so much more. And I think it's consistent with your point about adaptability.
And Ed, you mentioned for a second the topic of IoT and security on the edge, and you know, it's interesting, right? Like I would say that it makes things more complex because now you have IoT devices, they're deployed at the edge. IoT devices used to be not very smart. Now they're more intelligent. You have storage of a data, you have NLP, you have embedded AI, you have video streaming. And so devices can move around, which makes detection harder because IP addresses can change. Somebody can go tamper with the device or physically steal it. So it just creates a lot more complexity. So where do you see IoT security on the edge? Just like, where do you see it playing? Do you feel like that we're going to need new techniques to protect devices, or just old techniques like encryption of the data? Like, what is your view on the IoT and security on the edge?
Well, first, let me give the provision that when I think IoT, I'm thinking industrial as opposed to like the Alexa that's sitting on your desk. I have board responsibility, run the board subcommittee, in fact, for this gigantic energy power and light company in New York City, in the New York area, where we've been nukes and other things. So that is the ultimate in worrying about IoT/ICS. So I just want to make sure that when I say IoT, I mean things that, if they go wrong, then a bunch of people die. So that's the first thing. The second is that I think what's happening, Alex, in this area, you mentioned network edge. I think what's happening is that this traditional IT/OT gateway that people talk about all the time, you got SCADA on one side, and then you've got a intranet on the other, and you put this gateway, and never the two should meet. Well, everybody on this call would be the first one to say, gosh, perimeters don't work. We need to use zero trust. You can have insiders on either side of a perimeter, and on and on. And you talked about the attack surface. Well, that IT/OT gateway, that attack surface is increasing. There's wireless connectivity in, there's connection to cloud, there's connections back to the support vendor to upgrade the equipment. There's connections at every layer in that produce stack. I think what's happening, Alex, is deperimeterization is going to occur in industrial control. And this hiding behind a gateway, for the same reason we don't hide behind a gateway in a business, we're not going to be able to hide behind a gateway in OT. And to me, that's both exciting and terrifying. It's exciting, meaning I like zero trust so much better than a gateway. I want the wind turbines, and I want the components in an airplane, and I want the autonomous pieces in a factory, and I want the centrifuges in a nuclear power plant. I want all of those things to be in a zero trust engagement, meaning there's no lateral traversal threat behind an OT gateway. I like that. But where it's terrifying is that I worry that there's unfortunately still a skills gap in people like us. There's a lot of IT people here that, even Alex, you and I, a couple of computer scientists. I'm not a process control engineer. I'm trying to learn it, given the work that I do over there. But I didn't grow up in that world. And I worry that there's going to be a slower, a bumpier transition. It was easier to do in an all IT environment to go from perimeter to zero trust. It's still all the stuff we're consistent. Like ZTNA is not that different from VPN in terms of the underlying TCP/IP and the operating system, all the same stuff. But man, when you start messing around with, CAN buses on vehicles, or look at the way a rolling stock and a railroad work, rolling stock meaning the railway vehicles, these are way different. And that is one of my big fears in IoT/ICS, that it's going to be a bumpier transition to zero trust, because we don't know how a lot of those things work. And the people who do that work look at SecurityScorecard and say, security what? They didn't grow up in that world. That's not their discourse. So that's good. It's not a place where you want to have bumpiness when you have the word nuclear in there somewhere. That seems like a bad combination of words. So,
Right.
Thank you.
So Ed and Alex, we have a number of questions which have come. This is a great discussion, and I would love to just listen to you two guys riff off each other. Some of these questions are a little more tactical and probably more like actionable, but would love your feedback. So the first one is, on the assumption that hybrid work is a reality going forward, what is that one key investment every security team should be making to make their organization resilient in a hybrid workforce? And related to that, there's another question which says, based on everything you guys have seen, if you had to prioritize the 1 to 3 cybersecurity investments for the next 5 years, how would you stack rank those? So 2 questions on implementation and investment in the next few years.
By companies, right?
By enterprises, yes.
Alex, I have the same answer to both, so I'll go quickly. I think the skills gap has to be dealt with. It's here's what I see. There was a movie that my kids loved called Sandlot, and it was a few years ago, about a bunch of little kids on a baseball team, and it's a fun movie. If you have, maybe some of you share a generation with me, remember that dumb movie. But it was a bunch of kids where there was one player on the little league team who became a major leaguer. a couple that were pretty good, and the others were just sort of scrub kids playing. That's every IT security team I've ever met in the Fortune 1000. There's a few that are great. There's a bunch that are doing their work, and there's some that are terrible. That group is up against the Chinese military or the Russian military or the US military or whatever. They're up against nation states. It'd be like that ragtag little league team having to play the Boston Red Sox. You can give them whatever equipment or systems or assistance, and that can really help. But I think until you address the fact that we have a lot of missing skills, you're still going to have a disparity. That little league team needs help. They need vendors. They need the help. But that would be my number one bit of advice. Address the team, get the best people you possibly can, and they'll make good decisions.
Yeah, so my top 3 investments, which covers the question of a hybrid work, and the top 3 investments would be: number 1, make sure you deploy either multi-factor authentication or passwordless on all your systems. I would say that's kind of number 1. Passwords are just a bane of everybody's existence. Either deploy multi-factor authentication or go passwordless. Number 2, make sure you have a robust, it's not sexy, but make sure you have a robust patching program in place. Just too many companies are still not patching their systems and don't have a capabilities to do it. And then number 3, figure out how to really discover and compare yourself to others, whether it's an attack surface solution, whether it's some type of a security rating solution, but figure out how to compare yourself to other companies in the market. Having that external visibility from the hacker's viewpoint, I think, is crucial.
Got it. The next question is, well, what do I do if I'm ransomware attacked? What is the negotiation strategy if I am attacked and some systems in my corporate get locked? What do I do? What is the rational approach to responding to that situation?
I'll preface to it, right? It's like asking a question, what do I do if, God forbid, I get cancer, right? It's a little bit, of course, nobody can prevent it, but I think you should be asking a question, what do I do beforehand to avoid becoming a victim of a ransomware attack? That's number 1. Back up all your sensitive data. Number 2, establish a playbook of who you're going to call. Number 3, security awareness for your employees. And number 4, network segmentation, right? So those 4 things. But if you are hit by ransomware, my advice is leave it to the specialists, right? If you're hit by ransomware, call a forensic firm that specializes in ransomware negotiation, recovery. Do not do it yourself.
Alex is right. Those are good bits of advice. I remember in business school, I went to Columbia Business School. There's a case study we did on something called Ivy Block, which is this amazing cream that if you put it on you, there's no way you get poison ivy. You could go lay in the damn thing and you're not going to get it. But they couldn't make money because it wouldn't fix the poison ivy. If you got it, you're just going to suffer for a week or whatever. But it was great at preventing it. And they couldn't even make it. Maybe you can buy it still, but it would certainly not a product we all know. Isn't that funny? The idea that you've got something that literally can prevent something, you can't sell it. But if you had something that you put it on poison ivy, you'd make $1 billion. Right now it's just calamine that you put on, doesn't even work. But can you imagine if you had something that made it go away? We'd all be billionaires. But Ivy Block is a good metaphor for what Alex was saying. The best thing to do is 2 steps. Figure out how to handle it. But then the next thing is you better get religion fast. Don't let it happen a second time. So there are really good ways to prevent it. But once it happens, it's not an easy thing to tangle your way out of. A lot of people just end up paying the darn cryptocurrency and then moving on. So good luck if that's happening.
Yeah. So one was on blockchain. Is blockchain inherently secure? And if yes, if not, is there a role for enterprises right now to respond to this emerging topic, or is it just something they should be monitoring?
I mean, I think the devil is in the details, right? Like, I think the implementation makes a huge difference. How you implement it, how you build it, how you write code, how you deploy it, it makes a huge difference, right? Like, it's like asking a question, is RSA encryption protocol secure? No, it's not secure. It depends on how you use it. You have to have a large enough cryptographic key. You have to pad the plain text that you encrypt in a proper way. I mean, you have to concatenate, like, in order to get really secure, chosen, I mean, I'm a former cryptographer, right? But in order to get CCA2 chosen ciphertext protection, you need to use the tool in a specific way. So the blockchain is an amazing idea, amazing concept, right? On paper, it's solid, right? Like, on paper, it's solid. The way that it works, the way that it's structured on paper is solid cryptographically, right? Like, and algorithmically. But how you build it, how you do it, that's where the devil is in the details, and that's where the attackers are going to come in.
Got it. You talked a lot about ICS and industrial security, and I think you touched upon automobiles a little bit. As we look ahead to a world of EV and at least semi-autonomous vehicles, do you see a similar zero trust type environment prevailing in the auto industry, or do you think it's gonna evolve in a different way? The security.
100% zero trust. Let me give people a sense of what we mean when we say zero trust. If you and I both work in the same company, we sit in cubicles next to each other, and we're on the same local area network the way it used to be, and we had sort of a trust relationship on the network between our computers, then you getting infected is a problem for me because we're in the same enterprise domain, we're connected, it's bad. Now let's pick that up and imagine you're a Verizon wireless subscriber and I'm a Verizon wireless subscriber. We're not in the same family or anything. We just happen to use the same carrier. And we're sitting in the same room next to each other. And now your device gets infected and you get attacked. And you're using the same source of software, the same image, the same network. I also happen to be a Verizon subscriber. Do I care that you got affected? No, there's no trust relationship there. That's what we mean by zero trust, that there's no lateral traversal there. So for industrial control, for cars, for everything, that's exactly the way cars need to be operating. They need to be running along. And when my vehicle and Alex's are both on I-95 and we're both speeding into New York City and they're autonomous and we're sitting there flipping through a magazine as they hurl us toward New York City, those two vehicles should be communicating, encrypted, authenticated, and suspicious of each other, sharing data and trying to make sense of if his car tells me, hey, it looks like there's a barrier I see up there, you better slow down. I need to determine whether to believe that or not. You know, is that right? Like, there's a whole interaction that comes, but zero trust will be at the root of that. And it's a very good thing. Zero trust is good, not bad. It's a wonderful way to do computing. And I think it's going to be essential to autonomous vehicles.
Right. We are getting close to time. I wanted to throw in one last question is, if each of you could found the next iconic security software company, what problem would you each solve? 30 seconds each.
Minimal viable security.
Alex, you've already done it, right?
It has to be the next one.
Well, look, I mean, the truth, as an entrepreneur, I can tell you, it's all about execution at the end of the day. You know, ideas are a dime a dozen, right?
Yes.
At the end of the day, it's execution. No, like, I would talk about minimal viable security. How do we really start thinking about what is a minimal, just like you have a minimal viable product, what's a minimal viable security for companies? I don't have like an incredibly firm idea there, but I feel like there's something there.
Yeah, like minimum viable tax on corporates. Well, this has been a great pleasure, guys. I think we could have continued this for another hour, but again, on behalf of NGP and our audience, I really wanted to thank you, Dr. Ed Amaroso and Dr. Alex Yampolksiy, for a scintillating discussion. We'd love to have you guys back at some point in the future and on new topics. But again, thank you so much for taking the time. I think all of us just want to wish you a happy holiday season ahead. and stay safe and all the best.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ed.